we would like to hop directly into the next talk. We are happy that this is even possible. Unfortunately, not in person, but as a digital recording. Nadia Yala Kisukidi is talking about De-Westernization and African philosophy. She will try to draw the idea that epistemic decolonization has nothing to do with a new expression of theoretical melancholia, but with a certain understanding of remaining alive. Thus it breaks with the classic idea that the subjects of philosophy have to be dead to their own bodies. Nadia Yala Kisukidi was born in Brussels from a Congolese father and a Franco-Italian mother. She is associate professor in philosophy at Paris 8 Vincent Saint-Denis University, member of the critical time Les Cahiers d'études africaines and Multitudes editorial committee. She is now co-curator of the Yango Biennale that will take place in Kinshasa in November 2021 and January 2022. Yala Kisukidi is specialized in French and Africana philosophy. She taught in Switzerland, France, contributed to the creation of a Global South research network between Haiti, France, and Colombia. She has published and directed collective essays for the review Tumult in 2019. She is now preparing a book on Africana philosophy.
Hi, hello. I'm very happy to be part of this moment with you all. I'm so sorry because and I can't be there with you, but I'm happy to share this text with you that is at the core of some works I already did. So this lecture is called The Ending of a Spiritual Desire of Death. What does decolonization of philosophy mean? Is philosophy the real object of such a critical operation? Is the idea of epistemic decolonization a new contemporary expression of theoretical melancholia? The story is well known. There is no need to repeat it endlessly. Philosophy as a discipline is connected to a body, a color, a topos. At the core of the philosophical discourse, the strange desire can be emphasized, a desire of abstraction, that is, a spiritual desire of death. To erase the faces, the skins, and the topoi that are the material conditions of the production of the philosophical discourse. The desire of spiritual death bears a name. It is the movement of the universal. The topoi, faces, bodies that build the philosophical discourse are accident. The contents and forms of the philosophical discourse are de jure, the property of whole human beings. This universal property embodies the mythologies surrounding the idea of philosophy. As Fabien Ebousi-Boulaga has shown in his groundbreaking work, the Muntu crisis. It is what defines humanity, a sign testifying the excellence of humanity, as would say ironically Mamusediani. The mythologies of a philosophy without bodies appears desirable. It promotes a minimal claim of emancipation. The subjects of philosophy are dead to their own bodies. To be part in the discourse of philosophy is to enter a kingdom, the kingdom of real equality. What affects the body, history, stigmata, marks of domination, does not have effect on the intellectual life. The real intellectual life blossoms once released from the materiality of the world, that is to say, the life and the violence the latter bears. As I told you, when I started this lecture, the validation of such mythologies can't be taken seriously today. Contemporary critiques have unveiled the lie and the false universal, but through this unveiling, the desire of philosophy has remained intact. Even if this desire, however, arises from an internally divided library. The first library remains the utopia supposedly achieved by the name philosophy, the sovereign and heroic reason that never fails and that takes responsibility for the emancipatory process of humanity against power and theology. But the second one is what we could call the library of torn pages. The pages that are torn by the ones who discover throughout their readings that they are targeted. When those readers discover they have no history, no civilization, no rationality, no kingdom, Black, women, children, African, and many others. Of course, in the humanities and the social sciences, philosophy is no exception. But what is interesting is how the first answer to this mythology was expressed in the claim of what Jacques Derrida called a right to philosophy. One way to solve the epistemic injustices linked to race, colonialism, gender, and class is to reinvent the forms of a discourse that was rooted in gestures of exclusion. Here, reinventing means to conquer new conceptual territories, to make a room for all the subalternized voices, to show that philosophy is not the exclusive property of dominant bodies. Philosophy has to be practiced from the margins, listing the missing properties, exploding the geographies of philosophical reason, pluralizing the meanings of the name philosophy without giving up the desire that defines it, to belong in the wide community of knowledge and souls. This desire of philosophy was at the core of an important philosophical debate that took place in Africa in the 50s. A famous debate called, "Is there an African philosophy?" This is what is shown by Fabien Ebousi-Boulaga in The Muntu Crisis, this book written in 1977. I quote Fabien Ebousi-Boulaga in French. Pourquoi revendiquer le droit à la philosophie? Pourquoi s'évertuer à affirmer ou à démontrer que la philosophie fait partie de son héritage culturel et des activités auxquelles on se livre dans le présent? I translate in English. What is the purpose of claiming a right to philosophy? Why do we try very hard to maintain or to demonstrate that philosophy is a part of our cultural legacy and our present activities? According to the thinker Fabien Ebousi-Boulaga, the African philosophy debate must be understood under the theme of a right to philosophy. This expression, right to philosophy, used by Boulaga in 1977, echoes Derrida's reflection from 1975 until 1990 on the issue of the teaching of philosophy, the academic institution, and the politics of philosophy in school and in the university, especially in the north part of the world. According to Derrida, right to philosophy is a complex expression whose senses emerge within several questions. But it defines, in general, a legitimate or legal access to what can be called philosophy. Philosophy whose identity in itself is always problematic. Who can legitimately claim to be a philosopher? Who can legitimately learn, discuss, represent philosophy? Who is allowed to represent philosophy? But the question of decolonizing philosophy cannot be understood as the repetition of this Derridian claim, a right to philosophy. The difference between the Derridian expression, the right to philosophy, and the process of decolonizing philosophy is that the second one do not care, as I will show, about the becoming of philosophy in itself. On the contrary, once the mystifications the philosophical discourse produced are criticized, is a practice of philosophy worth it? It's quite provocative. How does the epistemic decolonization affect the forms, the contents, and the existence of philosophy in itself? Beyond the discipline of philosophy, the requirement of a decolonization of philosophy has been expressed in many African writings for the past half century. Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, Aimé Césaire, Senghor, Boulaga, and other thinkers from the Caribbean or Africa have exposed the problem of the decolonizations of the disciplines and the philosophy. Those writings are products of real political struggles or the results of critical operations questioning the policy of knowledge. If we try to define the decolonization process they embody, it can be emphasized in three different ways. First, the transfer of symbolic power, that is, and I quote here Ramon Grossvogel, to build non-European Occidental epistemic territories. Second, the critique of the scientific productions of the North constituted as a center. How can the growth of non-European knowledges interact with Eurocentric knowledges, dialogue, rejection, disobedience, hybridization, and at least the possibility to query the institutionalization of knowledge, that is to say, to develop a critique of the university. The epistemic decolonization process is less a fixed methodology, as would also say somebody like Walter Mignolo, than a critical operation not clearly specified on the descriptive and normative levels, rooted in the loci. So, what, for instance, could the purpose of such a decolonization of philosophy mean in the Western world? I am speaking from Paris now. Are some subjects excluded from such a process? And what kind of critical practices can be explored in the North? As we all know, Africa is deprovincialized. In the northern part of the world, some voices of the diaspora take the responsibility for the requirement of a decolonization of knowledge. The history of philosophy in France, for instance, requires a differentiation of the good, the true, and the beautiful that is based on a specific mapping of the reason. What form could a project of decolonization of knowledge undertaken in the North have? What's more, what form could such a project take in a country like France, for example, where philosophy as a discipline has been seen as a part of a unified Republican and Universalist narrative since the end of the 19th century? First, before showing that decolonization of philosophy can be, we have to emphasize two kinds of pitfalls it can encounter in northern universities. First, it can be an empty programmatic injunction, a slogan. Second, it can express a nostalgic way to reenact material struggles on a symbolic level. But this theoretical project must face what we could call the tricks of coloniality. In the language of the decolonial critique, coloniality defines a power apparatus that is linked to historical colonialism, but whose forms are repeated beyond the process of political decolonizations. This power apparatus lies on the colonial difference and fuels it. The cunning of coloniality describe how structural expressions of the colonial difference may reappear through critical processes that are supposed to erase them. This cunning can take two different forms. On the one hand, if we consider the perspective of the dominated bodies, the decolonization of philosophy becomes a struggle for the own ownership of a name, relying on an implicit desire of vertical recognition. This understanding of decolonization is linked to what the philosopher Fabien Eboussi-Boulaga already called in the 70s the synthesis of the poor and the alienated. Criticizing the ethno-philosophical writings and the Senghorian negritude, Boulaga undermines the arguments of hybridizations, métissage, from which the subaltern justify their practice of philosophy, their desire to contribute to the field of philosophy. The objective is to reach the grand rendezvous. All the cultures have to show how they contributed to enrich a paradigm that remains incomplete if it is exclusively understood through its European version. Behind the rhetoric of the contribution is hidden, as Boulaga shows, a rhetoric of defeat and loss. The act of troubling the norms of the philosophical discourse has nothing to do with an act of epistemic decolonization. It is a sign of poverty and deprivation, reminding the colonial prose some people did not invent anything. On the other hand, we have to understand the effects of the neoliberal context, where knowledge is seen as a commodity. The project of decolonization in northern universities can be surrounded by suspicion. Those projects have to face new economical and cultural form of cannibalism, to swallow fresh meat, to renew theoretical paradigms that are considered exhausted. The recognition and the legitimization of subaltern knowledges responds in this case to the market demand, the tumultuous injunction to innove and to create. The purpose is to save a name, philosophy, and to show how it can be redeemed for money in the market of knowledge. The idea of the margins, outside, inside, appears as an attractive mean. It draws a clear line between what can and what cannot be assimilated. What can't be assimilated builds up a reserve, the possibility to guarantee the continuous emergence of conceptual constructions that are desirable and competitive. The idea of margins in this context constitutes a new way to save plans for the future. So, what happens to the idea of decolonizing philosophy when it does not fuel surreptitiously a never-ending desire of vertical recognition, or when it is not trapped in an economy of knowledge that ruins its critical and radical gesture? Consequently, can the decolonization of knowledge only be identified with a commemorative practice, reminding constantly the injury inflicted to ancient colonized people? Commemorative practice whose purpose will only be critical, that is to say, destroying the hoaxes and mystifications of the grand narratives of modernity. As we know, the work of decolonization in the North is important. To put it quickly, the South lives in the North and is part of it, as is shown by Southern diasporic dynamics. So this project of epistemic decolonization has to do something with the policy of reparations. It has to destroy a cultural axiology based on epistemic injustice. The critical project of decolonization is written from the point of view of the violence inflicted to the subaltern. It describes subjectivities affected by the colonial wound through three modalities: the tearing, the splitting, and the loss. The tearing describes the impossibility to express oneself without a major language. The splitting has the impossibility for the self to coincide with oneself. And then loss, what was destroyed by the colonial violence, has definitely disappeared. Those expressions of the diasporic subjects show that a practice of epistemic decolonization faced what we could call an undecolonizable. On the subjective level, the undecolonizable describes an experience of irrecoverable loss. Something like a pre-colonial and immaculate identity cannot be recovered. On the epistemic level, the undecolonizable refers to that which cannot be examined by a critic precisely because it is the very condition of this critique itself. It shows the limit of a project of epistemic decolonization carried out by academic institutions in solidarity with the research protocol they promote. The history of those normative protocols is linked to a modern idea of what critique is and to a certain understanding of the emancipatory process. Those protocols are clandestinely repeated in the theoretical projects that examine them. Nevertheless, this undecolonizable does not fuel a policy of despair, as would say Dipesh Chakrabarti. There is no inherent impossibility of decolonizing. It just shows that the situation of enunciation compels the theoretical satisfaction such a project can bear. In a way, through those reflections, we understand that the problem of the becoming of the name philosophy is now a secondary problem. Once we interrogate the purposes of the decolonization project, we understand that it bears a specific meaning. This is this meaning I want to define to conclude this short lecture. Butler and Atanasio, in a book called Dispossessions, the Performative in the Political, shows how dispossession opens up a performative condition of being both affected by injustice and prompted to act. Dispossession defines a criticism of the sovereign subject and its property. It is also political reflection, how to demand regard by refusing to become disposable. The subjects inflicted of violence are open subjects living in a world that do not support them. The aim of a decolonization process is to create a supporting world. The theory, no matter which disciplines are involved, has to imagine how to build such a version of the world. They have to take responsibility for the questions of the livings and the world they inhabit, where the experiences of openness and exposure to violence are de jure shareable and in fact often shared. The epistemic decolonizations attempts to break with some theoretical productions fascinated by a desire for a spiritual death that is at the core of the history of philosophy. Those theoretical desires are not able to produce politics for the future because an emotional investment in the future has become impossible. It reactivates the necessity to recall the body. Or one of the goals is to operate the affective conversion of those theoretical practices. In spite of the cunning of coloniality, epistemic decolonization is just an attempt to produce a world that is not based on colonial difference. It promotes a time politics to read strategically the past from the idea of a future that remains desirable. Refusing to forget does not fuel a longing desire of returning to origins or negative feelings like resentment. Forcing the future against the night, neo-colonial nights, and dawns of neoliberal Western democracy. If it questions further codes of academic disciplines and their routines, the results of these critical practices remains indifferent to their becoming. Their purpose is to reinforce utopian consciousness and to operate first the changing of view described by the Guadeloupean poet Daniel Maxime in his beautiful tribute to Aimé Césaire. The Afro-diasporic people are not the sons and daughters of oppression and wounds, but the sons and daughters of creative resistance to oppressions and wounds. They're alive, and even when they're dead, they call for a fleshy desire of life. Thank you very much.